Before we get started, just a quick update for the podcasting community in academia and higher education. Higher Ed PodCon is in Cleveland in July this summer. And for year 2, we've expanded to 2 full days of sessions, conversations, and practical discussions focused entirely on podcasting in higher education. We have over 30 speakers lined up from the US, Canada, UK, and even Italy. I am really excited about the diversity of voices from a broad range of institutions speaking at PodCon this summer. We have our full list of sessions on the website. Early registration is still open. We've worked really hard to keep the cost of attending as reasonable as possible. Registration actually includes breakfast and lunch both days. And you'll see we've negotiated some super affordable hotel rates nearby. So please join us July 16th and 17th. You can learn more and register at higheredpodcon.com, higheredpodcon.com. Hope to see you there.
There's so much knowledge locked up inside researchers' minds and behind journal paywalls that doesn't get out there into the world, and we want to get it out there in as an accessible way as possible. Our tagline on the conversation is academic rigor, journalistic flair. So it really does actually marry those two things together. We're trying to get that knowledge out there to as many people as possible. And we don't care what kind of knowledge it is. We think academic research is fascinating in all of its shapes and sizes and disciplines and everything. So yeah, we want to get more people understanding what expertise says about the world.
Welcome to Continuing Studies, a podcast for higher education podcasters who want to learn, connect, and get inspired. I'm Neil McPhedran, founder of higheredpods.com and Podium Podcast Company.
And I'm Jennifer Lee Gunson, founder of JPod Creations. Podcasting is broadcasting. If you're podcasting in higher ed, you're not alone. There's a fast-growing community out there, and we're here to help you tap into it.
We are, Jen. Speaking of community, we've talked about this on the last couple of episodes, but where's Jen and Neil? We are going to be coming to you at some conferences.
Yes.
Jen, you're going to be in London for the podcast show. Do I have the name right?
Yeah, it's just called the London Podcast Show, or as the cool kids call it, LPS. And I'm going to hopefully find a lot of our UK friends and meet up with them, the people that we've been talking to in the last few years on continuing studies.
LPS, that's great. And that's in May. And then in June, I'm at ePod. That's in Leeds in late June. And then in July, we're together at Higher Ed PodCon in Cleveland, and we are recording there. So reach out to Jen and reach out to me. Our contact details are in the show notes. So Jen, today we are chatting with Gemma Ware. She is head of audio at The Conversation UK and host and co-producer of The Conversation Weekly, which is a show that brings academic expertise into the news cycle through narrative-produced audio stories.
And you know what I have to say? I'm really loving, like when we first started, there was a lot of people from North America, which is great. But now we're starting to see so many others around the world, specifically coming from the UK. We've been interviewing so many people in the UK. So it's really neat to get a taste of what's going on over there, and just seeing that higher education podcasting is just like booming there.
I totally agree, Jen. And we even had that with a listener from Ireland who was on a big commute and put a note on his LinkedIn about a couple of episodes he'd listened to. So we love to hear that.
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, there you go.
We're famous in Ireland.
Excellent. So this is a great conversation we had with Gemma. Why don't we just get into this, Jen? Welcome, Gemma. It's so great to have you here on this episode of Continuing Studies.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, The Conversation sits in a very unique space between academia and journalism. So how would you describe The Conversation?
I always like this phrase, which I think we use in some of our materials, which is democratizing knowledge, which sounds a little bit lofty, but I quite like that. I feel like it's what I hope to do. There's so much knowledge locked up inside researchers' minds and behind journal paywalls that doesn't get out there into the world, and we want to get it out there in as an accessible way as possible. Our tagline on The Conversation is academic rigor, journalistic flair. So it really does actually marry those two things together. We work with academics, and I say we ultimately we are journalists. So everyone who works as an editor at The Conversation is a journalist. We're trying to get that knowledge out there to as many people as possible. And we don't care what kind of knowledge it is. We think academic research is fascinating in all of its shapes and sizes and disciplines and everything. So yeah, we want to get more people understanding what expertise says about the world.
I love that you said journalist, because it's great that so many people can jump on the mic and now anybody can do it, which is awesome. But there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. When you come to higher education podcasts, it's nice that people are actually experts in their field or have actual journalism backgrounds when it comes to speaking information correctly.
If you think about the way The Conversation as a platform, as a website works, if you go on the site right now, everything you see will be edited by an editor who's a journalist, but it will be written by an academic. So we put expertise like front and center. That's what we want to do. And we fight that misinformation. We want to hear from the people who know the most, who've spent their whole life studying a subject. So yeah, we really value that.
What struck me when you were giving us the explanation of The Conversation was how much is locked away behind paywalls in journals. Essentially, you guys have been kind of like unlocking that and giving the direct access. But how much shaping, editing happens between that academic's expertise and then what ultimately ends up on the website or on your podcast?
Yeah, I will answer that, but I just wanted to go back to that point you made about the journals, because obviously there is a big movement for open access, and that's great. And even since I started working at The Conversation more than a decade ago, that's changed. In terms of how it happens, there is shaping, and that shaping is really just done from a perspective of the journalist saying, I think if you said this in this way, or you wrote this in this way, it would just be easier for somebody to understand it. So we commission articles and we ask academics to really think about that audience as being just a member of the general public. And so then we help them structure what they want to say and what they want to write so that it is just a bit more accessible. So there is quite a lot of editing that goes on the articles. Really depends on what that article is and who the writer is and if they've written before or if English perhaps isn't their first language. But we do also have 10 editions in 14 countries. So we have got non-English language editions and people writing from all over the world. So it's happening all over the place. And I think it's fantastic that it's growing as a platform.
Yeah, it's just so important. I really like the fact that The Conversation is growing. And you do a lot of work. Can you explain to us a little bit about your role and your team?
So I work in London. I've been at The Conversation for a decade, but we started making podcasts in 2016. And my role's really evolved since then. It was kind of a side project that me and a colleague called Annabelle Bly, who loved podcasts as much as me, were like, we should make podcasts. And we did that. And we launched a podcast called The Anthill back in 2016. It was trying to actually get at that concept you were just talking about, this idea that there's just, you see the surface of the knowledge of academics, but underneath there's just so much hidden in the ivory tower, as you might call it. We changed the name eventually. At the beginning, it was a monthly show, and we loved This American Life. So we would take a theme and then we'd talk to academics in kind of 3 or 4 stories each month around a theme. And it was really fun. And we talked to a whole bunch of different academics, but it was a lot of work. And monthly, I think it's quite a difficult, periodicity for podcasts. It can be difficult to gain traction. It's never your full-time job if you're doing a monthly podcast, but it takes loads of time. But also you don't really get through, you're not there on people's feeds every week or every day. So we decided to shift to series here at The Conversation at UK in around 2019. And we thought that limited series, where you really focus in on a topic and you can work with different co-hosts. So then we moved into that and we did that for a few years. And then during the pandemic, 2021 is when we decided to launch a weekly podcast, which is what I now host, called The Conversation Weekly.
That's great. I agree with you. That monthly cadence is tough. 2 points. One, it's not your full-time job, but it's still a lot of work to produce something. So you kind of end up off the side of your desk and it's less of a focus. But you're right about the audience. For 3 weeks, there's crickets in the platforms. It's tougher to kind of get that audience, but a weekly where you got a regular cadence, your show drops on the same day every week. We talk to shows we work with about the importance of that. And obviously you saw that. So obviously our audience are other podcasters. So we're going to kind of get a little nerdy here maybe about podcasting. So it's not just you. You have co-editors, you've got co-contributors, and then obviously you're the host. So you're not doing everything yourself. Tell us a little bit about your team and sort of how do you split it up?
For the weekly podcast, which is kind of our main one right now, it's gone through different iterations since it started. And I'd say that a lot of podcasts do that. They start in one way and then they move.
Yeah.
And that's just because I started off with a co-host called Dan Marino, who lived in San Francisco, not the football guy. He was one of the science editors at The Conversation US at the time. And the two of us started the show together. We were co-hosts. And it was tricky because 8 hours is a big time difference to work through.
We're on 8 hours right now.
We are on 8 hours right now. And so we would only be able to talk at the end of my day and very early in his day. But we made it work and it was great. And then he left, actually. He's gone to do a PhD in space policy. But yeah, so we then decided, okay, we're going to change it up a bit. But throughout that period, we've had kind of a main producer who's worked with us. He's lived in different places since we started. His name's Mend Marawani. He's currently living in Colombia. So everyone is a freelancer who works for us. And we have another freelancer called Katie who lives in Florida. We have a sound designer who works for us from Australia as well. So the team is very global. So we talk a lot on Slack. If people who are listening know Slack, it really helps us with a big team.
I love that about podcasting. Obviously, we're recording remotely, even though Jen and I are in the same city. We almost never record in the same place, but that's just the nature of it. And you're in the UK and Kylie, our producer, is here, but again, across town. And that's the beauty of it. You can pull together a team and they don't have to all be right there.
That's true.
Again, you can find the expertise that is needed. It's like I work with someone in England a lot for my company, and she is very knowledgeable. And that's the nice thing about this. You're not limited unto who you can work with.
Yeah. And it kind of parallels what happens in academia. People work across countries a lot, don't they? Yeah.
Very much so.
Your episodes, they're really great and they're produced really well. Can you walk us through like how you structure an episode? Like how do you start and how do you get to the ending?
So our current format really has this driving question that helps us choose topics and also structure the episode, which is how did we get here? So this is something that we developed over the last year. And I've been working with a colleague a lot in Australia called Ashley McGee, who's been helping us kind of hone that. And it really helps us dictate how we're going to do things. So our main source material is the academics who write and talk to colleagues at The Conversation. So they may have written for the site previously, or they may be about to write something, or they've just done it in the last few days. And so we think, okay, we think an element of what they've said could work as a longer podcast episode. And then we think, well, how can we tell that through an angle, which is like, how did we get here? Where's the story in this? It's kind of narrative storytelling through news, but through the expertise. So we need somebody who has that background, has that deep knowledge that comes from their academic expertise, but is also kind of willing to let us structure the conversation in the way we need it to hit the points in the right order, because that's something that we work a lot at beforehand. So we really plan the way we want the conversation to go from A to B to C so that we cover everything in a chronological order. And then we usually have a pre-interview with the academic beforehand to see if there's anything we've missed or things that they think is important that we should talk to them about. Also any personal stories they're able to bring in to cement their expertise like really early on in the conversation. And then we work to structure the questions. And then this is getting quite technical. Right. Once we've done the recording, which we do on the same platform that you folks use on Squadcast, we use Descript, which is a really powerful editor, which is linked to Squadcast. I'm not paid by Descript or Squadcast, but I do think they're really, really useful tools. And then we do an edit in that, and then we export it into a kind of an editing platform and go from there. And it goes through a fair few amounts of edits and iterations. And the beginning of each episode is a little intro from me that kind of really sets the scene, but you pretty quickly hear the academic. We're trying to cement the academic really at the top of the conversation.
I love your North Star question there of how did we get here?
I've even got it written on a Post-it note next to me. How did we get here?
That is a really good way to do it. Thank you for sharing those details. Again, like this is our audience, so it's perfect. So you're not necessarily coming at this of like, here's X academic, they've just put out this paper, let's interview them about this paper. You're coming at it from a different perspective. It's more what's in the news cycle, what is topical, what's being talked about out there, and then finding the academics to sort of create those stories, if you will.
I think that's right. I mean, in the past, we've done the other way. We have done stories that are really just driven by an academic piece of research. And I'm not saying that's the wrong way of doing it. And you can get great stories through that because the kind of process of understanding how a discovery was made, I think is really valuable. We still do that in other shows. But we've just decided to make this a little bit more tied to current affairs, what's in the news. But it doesn't have to just be politics, right? We can do quite sciencey. We can apply this question to any topic. You know, it can be a health story. story. We did one about flu vaccines, like how did we get here? How do we choose the flu vaccine this year? And the process that how that started out. But then again, we've done some quite political ones in the last few weeks about the war in Iran. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't necessarily flow from an academic paper.
And then coming at it from the perspective you are lends itself nicely to that storytelling, if you will, that narrative style.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of mirrors what the Conversation does on its site. So if you look at the Conversation's website, a lot of the stories are, you know, an editor has had an idea for a story because they've had a discussion in their morning news meeting and they're like, we think we should cover this angle. You know, what would it take for Trump to leave NATO, for example? And then they've gone away and found an academic to write about that. And it's not just that. We do also have academics writing about their new research. So it's not one or the other, it's both. And that's the mix of the stuff you get on the Conversation. You get both all those angles.
And you guys do a weekly podcast. And obviously these topics take time to put together. And it's very extensive research and lengthy, and even your production quality. How do you guys keep it going once a week?
Yeah, you know, I've been doing it once a week for 5 years. I had a kid in the middle, so I did take a break. But yeah, it is a lot. But I think we have such a wealth of ideas and perspectives that we can choose from. So it never feels like we haven't got anything to talk about. But yeah, I think that is the real issue for podcasting, isn't it? There's a word for it, I forget the name, but like the
pod fade.
That's it, pod fade. Or you do like 2 or 3 episodes and then you stop because it's hard. It's really hard. And you don't know who's listening. And if you haven't got like that direct kind of relationship where your listeners contact you all the time, which obviously some shows do, it can be quite lonely, I think. But you've had real support from the people at the Conversation who want us to keep telling these stories in audio. And I think there are different things happening in the world of audio right now that I think are posing a lot of questions for podcasting, how it works with video, for example. So yeah, we'll see where the future takes us, but it is difficult. I wouldn't advocate for a weekly show either. Like my preferred way of doing things is seasonal, doing like a season of 8 episodes and having a break and then a season of 8 episodes again. I think that's a nice cadence.
You're a news organization, so that's tough. There's more of a keep going, moving forward, right?
We do have a break in the summer, in my summer here in the UK. Yeah.
That's good. So working with academics, you're interviewing academics all the time. What have you learned about how they might communicate on a mic? I'm sort of curious, like what have you seen there that maybe from a tips perspective as well too for the other podcasters working with academics?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's sometimes easier for an academic to explain something in words than it is to write, because there are ways to write for academic language on the and sometimes it's actually easier to say, well, look, you don't know me. I'm not an expert in your subject. Just explain it to me like you would. And you have to not be scared of asking dumb questions, right? And that's like a key thing of
there are no dumb questions.
No, exactly. You have to just like, what does that mean? Yeah.
That's harder in academia to get your head around that.
I think that's true, particularly when you're talking to a peer or someone in your own discipline. Whereas like I'm an outsider to these people's disciplines, right? They don't expect me to know anything. We have an interesting way of dealing with this in the written word, where we have this kind of metric that we have built into our editing platform on the site, on the Conversations backend, which essentially gives you kind of a rating of how readable your words are for like a 15-year-old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we're kind of looking at, I think, a 15 or 16-year-old, and it gives you kind of a little score. But I think that's quite a good person to be aiming at, you know, like your teenage neighbor or like your teenage nephew or niece or something. So they're interested in you. You've got their attention, but you really need to help explain it in an easy way. And I mean, obviously there are academics we've spoken to who are really difficult to understand in terms of the technical like language that they're talking about. But you know, most people, if you ask them questions like, how did you do this? What were you doing when you discovered this? What was it like in the lab that day? Tell me the story of how you did this. Like, when did you have this thought that you thought, oh, I'm going to discover this? They will tell you, because they're all humans, right? They've all got emotions about the way they do it. And I find that really interesting. Obviously, some academics have had really great media training. And I think there's a growing cohort of younger academics who are just a bit more comfortable. You know, they've finished their PhD and they're actually ready to talk about it. There's obviously countries in the world that have a bigger tradition of public intellectuals, like France, for example, than others. But I think I'm all for younger academics who've really done fieldwork very recently and are really in tune with their area of expertise, getting out there and talking to more people about their research. I don't think it should just be reserved for people who are higher up the tenure track, for example.
I like that, because I think sometimes we get fixated on, we're talking to someone with, potentially multiple PhDs and they're an expert in this field and kind of nervous about asking a dumb question. But I like how you put it. Let's just like, we're still people at the end of the day, and you can still sort of explain things in a more understandable way for the general world.
If someone's agreed to be interviewed by you and you've explained to them what you're doing, then they're kind of ready to explain their work. If you've kind of called them up out of the blue and asked them to give you a 2-minute quote for a news story you're doing, it's different. But like the relationship we have with them, we really set it up, we explain what we're doing. And
Right.
I think that helps.
Yeah.
And I just have no shame because I've been on radio and I have failed with some famous people in interviews. So it's like nothing's going to compare to some of those bombs that I've done. So I don't really care what
And
questions I ask.
that's live too, right, Jen? Like
And
those
that's
would have
live.
been
We
like,
can edit this. And your show is global. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You're not just in the UK.
So the show is global. It's actually one of the few global products that The Conversation has. So The Conversation has this model where each edition is based in a certain country, and we get our funding from university members in those countries. So we're a non-profit organization, and there are editors of each of these editions. So, there's an editor in Indonesia, there's an editor in France, for example. And so from the get-go of our global podcast, The Conversation Weekly, we've tried to work with colleagues all over the world on that. There are other bits of The Conversation that have done podcasting and audio. So, for example, our Indonesian colleagues have a podcast in Bahasa Indonesian. We have a show from our colleagues in Australia. So they have quite a prominent political journalist there who has an academic position. She's called Michelle Grattan. That's called Politics with Michelle Grattan. I think it's pretty much every week, sometimes more if there's a big news story in Australia. And so that goes through their channels in Australia. There have been different limited series, like the US did one, TC Canada. So TC is our way of calling The Conversation. They had a long-running show called Don't Call Me Resilient, which was hosted by my wonderful colleague Vinita Shrivastava, who did this great show about conversations about race with mainly Canadian academics, but also a few American ones. And we actually ran a few of those shows through our channel. And so there's been different experiments with audio at different bits of The Conversation for years, really. And I love working with them. Actually, our Brazilian colleagues have just done one in Portuguese, kind of around the COP that just happened in the end of last year.
It's interesting. So if you go onto the Conversation website, wherever you are, it'll localize for you. And I like that sort of regional editorial team, but your podcast, The Conversation, it reaches globally, sort of across all those different regions. So you're able to kind of like pull then from those regional editorial teams. That gives you a real benefit, I would imagine, to be able to sort of pull from those different regions and to pull your episodes together a little bit more that way.
I mean, the way I see it, if you go on a podcast platform, wherever you are in the world, there's no regionalization. If you search for The Conversation, you might see a different homepage on your Apple podcasts or your Spotify, but you're still going to get the same podcast.
Yeah. So you've been at The Conversation for a while. How do you see podcasting within the larger mix strategically? Is it growing in importance? Is it still a little interesting corner off to the side of the larger conversation entity, and where you see inertia or not?
Yeah, I'd say that it's definitely not the center of what The Conversation does. I can't really see a point when it will be, if I'm honest. Like, the bread and butter of what The Conversation does is short articles aimed at a general audience for websites, and the reason that is kind of what we do is because we publish everything under a Creative Commons license and it gets republished. So if you publish on The Conversation, your article is likely to be taken up by many news organizations around the world, and we can track that. We have ways of kind of finding out how many people read those websites when they've taken our content, and so we feed that back to universities and we say, well, this is how many people were reached by your academic writing this story. And so it's a bit harder in podcasting to do that. Like, you just haven't got the data,
Right.
Unless you survey them. You don't know who your listeners are. You can obviously see where they are in the world on certain platforms, and you've got that demographic data that Spotify gives you, but that's quite limited. So I think in terms of where it sits in the strategy, it's never going to be front and center. But there is a real push to really think about multimedia. And when I say multimedia, I mean the move to video in podcasting that's happening across the world. And also, we could clip up this conversation we're having and put it on social media and make it a short vertical video for Instagram or, TikTok or YouTube Shorts. You can have a specific idea that travels quite far on those platforms. So that's something we're experimenting with. I'd say that where it plays a value in our strategy is that we can do really quite in-depth stuff in audio that keeps people's attention. I mean, one of the things I love, I don't know if you folks like it too, but like looking at how many hours people listen to your show.
Yes.
Like, I love that statistic that you get. It's like,
Yes.
I was looking at something the other day. It's like people have listened to this for 2,000 hours or something. I was like, that's amazing. I know I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I really like that someone has just sat with you and they've listened to to what your academics are telling them, and they've kind of been through it with you. That kind of in-depth timelessness of some of those stories that will keep going. I mean, we did a series called The Mysteries of Physics a couple of years ago, hosted by a colleague of mine here in the UK called Miriam Frankel, who's a physics expert on our team. And I mean, that show still gets a lot of people listening to it. And it's really deep, heady stuff about, these things about fundamental constants and the multiverse and stuff. And people are still coming back to that. And I think that offers us, as well as doing these more newsy, reactive pieces to, this thing's happening in the world. How do we get an expert to explain it to us because they're the expert? We can also tell longer stories and longer in-depth tale, I guess.
I think that's a really good lens to put on it. Podcasting affords you the ability to have those more in-depth conversations, but also what struck me earlier on in your last answer there was you were commenting on then being able to use that longer form piece of content to grab shorts from or reels for Instagram. And I've stopped thinking of them just being a discovery mechanism to drive you back to the long form. But instead of thinking about those as you may never get someone to come to the long form piece, but if you get them to consume a couple of the shorter bit, they're still part of your audience. But how do you take this long form piece that you've put a lot of work into, but also grab elements of it that can work in these other formats that are more short form, lend themselves to be more short form?
We haven't made a video podcast of the Conversation Weekly, but we did early this year launch a video podcast for the first time called Strange Health, which had one of our health editors co-hosting with an academic who's also a GP. And then they were really funny. And we just thought that their on-screen relationship would be fun to work in video. And we clipped it up and we put it on socials too. And it's doing well. So it's an experiment for us. But there's a whole other technical level of stuff going on with the video podcast. And I think you really need to, it's not the same. It's just not the same.
And I don't think everyone needs to do it. This is my personal opinion. Yes, I think you have to be on YouTube for searchability, 100%. And I think you need video clips now because those are, like I said, generating buzz. But do you have to put the whole thing up there? I don't know.
And one of the things for us is, I think, is maybe similar to what some of your listeners who work in academic podcasting, we don't carry advertising on our podcasting. So we don't turn on dynamic advertising because our brand as The Conversation, our whole USP is that we don't carry advertising. So we don't have it on our site. We don't have it anywhere. And so that really does actually, it feeds into some of the decisions that we make because we're not driven by going on YouTube for money. We're driven on going on there for discoverability,
Yeah, that is, very much the academic world of not putting ads in there. We work with an interesting example as we work with the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and they've got a wildly successful YouTube channel with millions of followers. And they could monetize it, but they don't, obviously. So it's a different world, a different reason for being. That's what I love about this sort of corner of podcast land, which is it's not about monetization.
I think it gives you difficulty in getting attention though on the platforms because you're not getting money. You're not trying to raise money and therefore the platforms don't have an incentive to push you.
That's a really good insight. And I think we are seeing that very much with Spotify right now, where we know because they admit it, their algorithms are built to favor video over audio because they can sell video ads for more than they can sell audio ads, and they're wanting to put those in there. So the algorithm on Spotify is now working against you if you are an audio only non-monetized podcast.
So then you have to build your audiences.
That's right. It's thinking about it a little bit differently. So maybe we sort of end with one question. What's the opportunity that you're seeing for the academia university world when it comes to podcasting?
I think the opportunity is that being niche in podcasting actually is rewarded because you can climb up the charts in the thing that you're in higher, right? So, if you are like the only podcast about, I'm just making something up here, worms or something, and people are interested in worms, like, you're going to come up I think perhaps one of the things that's quite seductive to universities is say, oh yeah, we'll just launch a podcast and it will just be across the whole university. And it's kind of, who are you targeting? Are you targeting your future people who come, your alumni? It doesn't really have a driving theme. And I think this is something that we're challenged with on the Conversation Weekly because we're so broad. And when we've decided to do series where we really dig down, do something deep, like the physics series I mentioned, we did a series about Jane Austen. We were really able to actually bring that deep knowledge to kind of a series model, get more traction for it. So I'd say lean into the expertise because there is such amazing stories and amazing people in academia. And they're not just their journal publications either. Like that's just what they put out into the world. But like actually there's loads that they do that never makes it onto a journal or things they failed at, that's interesting as well. And I think at the moment, one of the main ways of understanding academic research is through this lens of, what was published in a journal and how many citations you get. But actually, there's so much more and there's so many more stories to research. And I would say that's what I've really valued working with academics is understanding how they did things. It's educational content and we're crying out for that. The world is crying out for that. So I would lean into that. And I also would say that partnerships can perhaps amplify things. So if you're trying to do a series and you can see a media organization or another outlet or a independent podcast production company who you can kind of build a relationship with, that might just help you as an academic or as a department. So yeah, I say that, partnerships and lean into the niche.
Those are very good pieces of advice. There's a handful of really big shows that seem to suck up all the oxygen and attention. But really, at the end of the day, podcasting is this massive landscape of all these niche shows. And that's the opportunity for academia. And I like your idea about partnership. I think that's another good way to look at it as well, to help amplify what you're trying to do, but also help produce what you're trying to do.
Also, someone told me some good advice once, which was like, how long should this story be? And I think any journalist should think about this. Is this a story that's worth like 10 minutes on a magazine style show? Or is it a story that's worth an hour? Or is it a conversation that you could tell over multiple parts? Like if this bit of research that I'm trying to talk about, does it really warrant something bigger? Then try and find someone who can help you make it bigger, tell it in a longer way.
I think it is so important. I think you hit it on the head. An engaging story is a beginning, middle, and end, and you need to know how long that story is. So on that note, I think it's time for us to come to a close here.
I like what you did there.
Because I feel like we could keep talking to you forever, but we got a lot of good knowledge, and we just appreciate you coming on to Continuing Studies.
Another great conversation, Jen, pun intended, about the conversation. I really did enjoy that chat we had with Gemma. The one thing that really stuck out to me was that lens, that positioning that they put on each episode or as they go in and do research, which is this, how did we get here? Which is the question that they ask at the outset of each of their episodes. I really like that way of framing things up and looking at it and then going out there and finding the academics that are going to help them answer that question.
It's a great structure to an episode. I was just chatting with someone about that the other day. Is like sometimes podcast episodes aren't structured well, but how did we get here really gives you a map into some rich conversation.
Very much so. Okay, well, why don't we leave it there, Jen? Why don't you read us out?
Thank you for tuning into the Continuing Studies podcast, a podcast for higher education podcasters. We hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. If you enjoyed the show, we encourage you to follow and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so you'll never miss an episode. If you found this episode particularly valuable, please consider sharing it with your friends and colleagues who also might be interested in higher education podcasts. We also invite you to join your peers on higheredpods.com, where you can connect with other podcasters in higher education and learn from others in the field. Thank you for being part of our community. We look forward to continuing to bring you valuable insights and conversations around higher education podcasts. See you in the next episode.